Welcome everyone to this really interesting session, which I'm really glad to host because it's my ultimate favorite. It's about implementation support practitioners. And we have three ladies here that will provide you this symposium. And of course, they will pose some really interesting questions also at the end, and there will be time for discussion. So without taking any more time, I will let you introduce yourselves and I'll wait for you at the end for the discussion. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Pauline. It's so great to be with everyone this morning for me, this afternoon for most of you. So I'm Allison Metz, and I direct the National Implementation Research Network, which is at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I will pass it off to Katie.
Hi everybody, I'm talking to you from Dublin, and I work with the Centre for Effective Services in Ireland. We're a not-for-profit organisation that provides a lot of implementation support to ministries and government agencies, and that's my interest in this work. And I'm also a member of the board of EIC.
And my name is Bianca Albers. I'm a member of the team at the Institute for Implementation Science in Healthcare at Zurich University, and also co-chair this event. And we want to kick us all off by doing a bit of a sense, taking the temperature in the audience. So if you could open an additional browser, maybe on your phone, or on your computer, and find menti.com, then we would just want to ask you a few questions, which, with this being the first one, how are you by now? How do you feel by now? Please go to menti.com and use the code 46982356 to give us a sense of where you're at in your mental and emotional state.
Hello, I'm Chris Asano. I'm an anesthetist from Southport and Anscott, just north of Liverpool. I'm interested in the implementation of low-value clinical practice.
Sorry, Christian, I didn't get that. Was that a question?
No, I am interested in the implementation of low-value practice. Statement.
Yes. Thank you. So, focused, let's get going. Let's not waste any more time on this. Very good to know you're all in love. This happened recently. I love it. I would love to know who that is in the audience. Very nice. Good. Yes. Let's get going. I want to ask you another, and with that question, we get a bit more into your role. Could you share with us, are you an implementation support practitioner? You might know, you might not know, that's totally fine, but give us a sense of who we're talking to and with in this session. Okay. Very good. Quite a few implementation support practitioners here. Some who aren't, some who don't know, and hopefully you will know by the end of the session, of course. Good. Okay. An overwhelming majority of ISPs, and a little bit on top of that. Thank you for this glimpse into your roles. I'm going to share back to our slides, Allison, and then you take it away.
That's great. It'll be fun if at the end of the session, we can ask those 7 people who don't know if they think they are at the end of the session. So what we want to achieve in our short time with you all today is to define the role of implementation support practitioners and to spend some time talking about the principles that guide their work and the skills or competencies that we've done a lot of research on and think are really necessary for implementation support practitioners to play their role. We're going to introduce a new international practice guide We launched at the very end of 2020, and it contains a lot of this information that we'll be talking about today, and it was developed in collaboration with the European Implementation Collaborative, so very fitting for this conference, the Center for Effective Services, and our group at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And as part of that, we'll be discussing how the research findings and our work informed the practice guide, and we'll share some of that throughout the presentation. So we want to start kind of with an overall premise for our work and for thinking about support practitioners. So really grounding us in the overall goal of implementation science, which is to integrate research and practice experience in ways that improve the outcomes of those being served. So if we think about this, we think that implementation science includes both implementation research and implementation practice. So implementation researchers really seek to develop generalizable knowledge related to the implementation strategies that really help us translate research-based programs and interventions into the real world. And implementation practice seeks to apply those implementation strategies in a variety of contexts to achieve outcomes. So just to give a really quick example of that, implementation research has found that the use of teams is a very effective method for supporting implementation. So that's a generalizable finding that comes from implementation research. But in the world of implementation practice, the form that those teams take can look really different from context to context, and the structures that we put in place to support teams. So it's really both of these things that are really critical to building the science. So this graphic really depicts that, this idea that it's really a virtuous cycle between implementation research and implementation practice that helps us build the science of implementation. So implementation researchers are using methods to answer implementation questions. And then in the world of implementation practice, we test out those findings and come up with new ideas and new questions that feed back into implementation research. And through that cycle and the equal contributions of research and practice, we continue to develop the science. So who are these people that we think really bridge implementation research and implementation practice? Well, we refer to these folks, as we talked about in the beginning and in the exercise that you just did, implementation support practitioners. So we consider them to be professionals who support organizations, leaders, their staff in implementation of evidence-informed practices and policies. But what they're doing is they're using evidenced implementation strategies. So they're taking what we know from implementation research and they're applying that in a range of settings to really help different teams, organizations, and systems be able to implement change with good effect. One of the things that we want to mention here at the top of the presentation is we have a very inclusive idea about who are implementation support practitioners. So we think of those people really as anyone in your job that spends at least part of your time supporting implementation. So you could work in an intermediary organization, you can work in a nonprofit, you can work in a public system, you can be a consultant. So you can be working kind of external to a system or be internally placed within that system, but part of your role is to support implementation. So hopefully that helps for our 7 don't knows. That if any part of your day job is helping to support change and evidence use, this probably defines some of your work. So we think it's really important to define the competencies needed for implementation support practitioners, because these folks, again, whether they're consultants that are external to a system or whether they are within a service system or a community that is seeking to use evidence and improve outcomes, it's really important that they be able to do their job well. So as we continue to research and develop evidence-informed practices and programs, as well as implementation theories, frameworks, and strategies, unless we get better at applying them in practice, outcomes will not improve. So the role of the implementation support practitioner is really critical to be able to move the dial on outcomes. So we just wanted to give a quick kind of overview of when we talk about these competencies that we're going to spend some time with today, where do they come from? So we've been developing a research program on this area for, I think, about the last 3 or 4 years. Trying to think when we all first decided we're going to be working on this together. So over the last year and a half or so, we've had some publications come out, and you can see them here, and we encourage folks to kind of go back to this literature. But we really look to develop kind of a theoretical understanding of the role of implementation support practitioners. So that's the article on the right of your screen. But we've also done a systematic review of the strategies implementation support practitioners use, and therefore the skills that they would need to be able to use those strategies well, and have conducted a survey of folks who identify as implementation support practitioners internationally, and just released those findings in a recent publication on the left. And that's, just wanted to note that that's where a lot of this work is coming from. It's really grounded in both research and practice. So resulting from this, we re-released a set of competencies that we had initially released in 2017. And so just about 6 months ago, you'll see the document on your right, the implementation support practitioner profile that is available, and it describes the competencies and the activities that implementation support practitioners would conduct, as well as the principles that guide their work in a lot of detail. And then on the left is a practice guide to supporting implementation that we just released in December. And that is supposed to be a more user-friendly guide or manual to really help people who are in the workforce to think about the skills they need and how to improve their own practice in supporting implementation. So as I was describing that practice guide, we're going to be focusing a lot on that today in terms of talking through the principles and competencies that are in there and some helpful hints for implementation support practice. So just to note that the guide aims to define the role and functions of the implementation support practitioner. So a good thing to check out. You could have seen on the previous slide, there's a lot of places that you can access that. Everything is open source. To help organizations and teams who provide implementation support to describe what they do. So I think for many of us, it's hard when you're at a cocktail party and someone asks what you do, and you're like, well, it's a little hard to explain. So hopefully this gives us good elevator speeches to funders and to other community partners, and how the work we do is helpful. Cultivating a workforce of implementation support practitioners that really supports how we can reflect and learn about our own work and to improve it over time, and to really help with professional development for those of us that do this for a living, and to support communication and feedback to support that virtuous cycle between implementation research and implementation practice. So I'm going to hand it off to Katie to get a little deeper into the competencies.
So I'm going to cheat by answering a question already in the questions, which is, how does implementation support practitioner relate to implementation specialists? I would say they're very similar. So that might help whoever asked that question as we go through the rest of this. And the second thing I want to say is, Alison, we first presented the preliminary findings at the Dutch Implementation Week in Utrecht in 2018. And here we are in the Utrecht room.
I know, I
virtually.
love that.
So there is some karma going on there.
It's fabulous.
So we're really happy to be back with our Dutch friends for this piece. So I'm going to introduce you using this visual. So this is kind of the nub or the core of what we have, what has emerged from our work. There are lots of other interesting aspects to it, but this is at the core of it. So I'm going to just walk you through this. So, and I'm going to talk to you about the principles and the competencies. Bear in mind what Alison has said. This is based on both literature and research and our practice wisdom, how we have done this and how we have supported implementation over many years. So there are we think there are 6 principles that should guide the work of implementation support practitioners. And they're in the middle circle there. They're not in the right in the core. They're the be curious, be committed, use critical thinking. And I'm going to come back to them in 1 minute. And then there are 3 domains. So they're the 3 bubbles around the edge. And what we have done is we have grouped 15 competencies thematically into 3 domains. And I'm just going to explain very briefly the 3 domains to you. So the first domain I'm going to talk to you about is the one up the top, which says co-creation and engagement. And that's about actively involving stakeholders at each stage of implementation. And we've identified 5 competencies that are needed by the professionals who support implementation to involve stakeholders at every stage of implementation. And the competencies are co-learning, brokering, addressing power differentials, co-design, and tailoring the support provided by you as an implementation support practitioner. The second domain is the one on the right-hand side called ongoing improvement. And that's about using information and feedback to improve as you implement, as you go through the different stages of implementation. And we've identified 6 competencies that relate to that ongoing improvement domain. And they're listed down there from assess needs and assets, understanding context, down to things like facilitation, communication, and conducting improvement cycles. We're going to come back on each of these. I'm just giving you the helicopter view at the moment. The third domain is around sustaining change. So that's about how is whatever is being implemented sustained after the implementation support is finished, and has there been capacity built in the service, in the organization, the system to sustain that change. So we've identified 4 competencies that are needed to sustain change, and the 4 competencies are about growing and sustaining relationships, crucial. They're about developing teams, about building capacity, and about cultivating leaders and champions. So in the practice guide and the role profile that Alison gave you, there was a picture of the 2 guides. You will see activities and functions associated with each of those 15 competencies. And we've also included some helpful hints, which we're going to talk a little bit to give you some examples of some of the helpful hints, but there are many more in the practice guide if you want to look at them. So I'm going to talk now about the principles for a minute. So these are the principles which guide the day-to-day work of the professionals who support implementation. So what do we mean by principles? We wanted to define it. Principles are the foundational attitudes with which professionals who support implementation approach their work, their decision-making, all of their interactions with communities and organizations. And the 6 principles which should underpin the work of implementation support practitioners are listed there: to be empathetic, to be curious, to be committed, to advance equity, to use critical thinking, and to embrace cross-disciplinary approaches. I want to say a word about a couple of those. They're all important, by the way. I'm going to pick out a couple to say something about. So the first is a really important one about being empathetic. And that's about approaching the change facilitation process with regard for others who are involved in the implementation, and treating the others involved in implementation as legitimate and respected and valuable contributors to the implementation. So being committed as a principle is about patience and resilience as a professional, but it's also about being willing to challenge the status quo and demonstrating flexibility and agility when the going gets tough, when there are implementation setbacks. So those of you who are in this role know it's not easy. You need to be resilient, you need to be flexible, you need to be able to bounce back. And the third one I'm going to say something about is the final one, which is about embracing cross-disciplinary approaches. And this is about embracing and using different ways of knowing and a diversity of expertise across disciplines to bring about an effective implementation. So I'm now going to hand to Bianca, I think. Who is on mute. Oh, I'm not. I'm going to do my principles. Thank you. Sorry. Well, you all get to do some work now. So those are the 6 principles I've just described to you. And we want you to tick 3 of them. Which of these principles drive your work day to day? If there are others that you feel drive your work day to day, put them in the chat, please. So we haven't, Mentimeter does not allow us to do this, but you can put them in the chat. So go to menti.com and use the code 54224712, and you will be given this option. And we are asking you to tick up to 3 principles. So we want to see what principles drive the day-to-day work of the 60+ people we have in the room today. You can only tick 1 box. Oh dear, that's not good. Bianca?
I don't know what I can say to this.
Well, if you can only tick 1 box, you can only tick 1 box. That's exactly what I'll say.
Our band.
Okay. So we're quite curious. That's good. We're committed. Very good. Critical thinking. Yeah. Okay. Some of them are looking a little lonely at the moment. Okay. Okay. Keep going. Can you see how many responses we have, Bianca?
I can see, you know,
probably about 30 responses. Oh, I see it down the bottom. 36, 7. Okay. Keep them coming.
It's interesting.
I think everybody's only been able to tick 1 box from the numbers that are ticked.
Yep.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you to those who wanted to tick more boxes. We thought you might, which is why we thought we'd asked you to tick 3 boxes. But anyway, we have to be resilient and we have to respond to challenges as they arise. So you've just ticked 1 box. Thank you. I think the ones that are really resonating for people are about being curious, being committed, using critical thinking, and then embracing cross-disciplinary approaches. The ones that look a little more lonely are about advancing equity and being sympathetic. Being empathetic, which is also about sympathetic. But, okay, so hold that as we go through this, and we're going to have a couple of other exercises for you to reflect on as we go. Thank you, Bianca.
Excellent. Thank you. And I am now getting us back to our slides, and we're moving into these different competencies and talk about some of in the different domains, some of the concrete competencies that we have highlighted and Katie has highlighted for you already. We don't have time to cover it all. So we've decided within one domain, each of us will briefly talk about a particular competency. I will cover co-creation and engagement in this case and talk about the importance of addressing power differentials. And such a differential exists when the influence of one person or group involved in an implementation is different from that of another person or group. And it can be there because of differences in formal authority. A senior manager typically has greater decision-making power than frontline staff, and that can influence how the people that you work with as an ISP participate in processes, speak up, engage. A power differential may also emerge from less formal dynamics in the form of, let's say, nurses or social workers feeling inferior to the physicians on a team, or as disguised discrimination against particular individuals or groups involved in your implementation, or in other forms, which of course is a more tricky part to work with. Often the differential will be at play between others. And in that case, you as an ISP would work to take this differential into account and tailor your support in ways that makes it possible for individuals and groups at risk of being disengaged from the implementation to remain a strong part of it, to have a voice and to make their influence feelable. But a differential can also involve you personally as an ISP. For example, when you as an external actor brought into an organization or a system to facilitate change, and you realize that the physicians whom you are supposed to support and whom you depend upon in your work do not take you seriously because you have the wrong education, the wrong background, or some other characteristics that make you wrong in that setting. And in that situation, you may need to really carefully consider your entire approach to providing support, maybe confront the problem more directly, or find allies in the organization. So no matter what, this is surely a competence that requires a good degree of sensitivity and awareness of what is going on in the relationships between others and in the relationships between you and those you work with. All right.
Back to me. Thanks, Bianca. So the second domain we want to talk a little bit about is around ongoing improvement. So in other words, improving as we implement and as we move through the different stages of implementation. So there are 6 competencies identified for the professionals who support implementation in relation to creating an organization where learning is core, where people learn as they go, where risks are allowed, where people learn from mistakes, all those sorts of things. And the core competencies are around assessing needs and assets. So this is important in terms of adopting an assets-based approach to implementation as opposed to a deficit-based approach to implementation. So we must build on the strengths, as well as think about how to build capacity to address any gaps there may be. But it's really important to build on the strengths. Understanding context, facilitation, communication, conducting improvement cycles. So I want to stop for a moment on the third one, which is about applying and integrating implementation framework, strategies, and approaches. Because an ability to do that is really core to an implementation support practitioner. They need to be able to explore different implementation models and approaches and strategies with implementation teams and with governance structures, and to decide which work for different implementation goals, and to decide which will work in different contexts and in different settings. And it's really important that the right bundle of strategies is selected to meet the unique needs of a particular community in a particular setting. It's not a one size fits all. We need to know what are the needs of the community, what are the what is the context, what's the funding context, what's the policy context, and that enables us to select the right strategies and approaches. On to you, Alison.
Great. So I'm going to talk about the last domain, sustaining change. And what's interesting is we can also talk about how these competencies fit within these domains. And we've done some research around that, but I know you could kind of fit some of these in different domains as well. But we really think about sustainability and the implementation support practitioner's role in helping with that, helping communities and systems develop a shared vision, a sense of mutual accountability for the work. That sense of mutuality is so important for sustainability, facilitating relationships, problem solving, and resource sharing. So the competencies we include there, and there's been a little bit in the chat about that because I put something in there in the chat, around growing and sustaining relationships, and specifically around building trust. And we're just finishing up a study now with some qualitative interviews of ISPs. And the idea of building trust is of paramount importance, and in many ways seems to be a moderator of how successful any strategy we use is. That if we have a foundation of trust, that we're in a much better shape to be able to have successful implementation. And a lot of that relates to some things Katie just said too, around creating a sense of psychological safety for the work. Developing teams, which I'll come back to in just a moment. Building capacity, so there's been some chat in our chat about that as well. And so we do see the ISP's role in building capacity, and in the guide, we talk about different types of capacity. So general capacity, capacity specific to the program, practice, or policy, as well as adaptive capacity and analytic capacity. And so we're very much, ISP's role is to do that type of work. And then finally, cultivating leaders and champions. So really being able to identify emerging leaders, to distribute leadership for the initiative, and to grow champions, which there's some really nice research coming out on champions in the last couple of years, which is great to see. So thinking about developing teams, just want to say that the ISP's role cuts across different aspects of that. So some of it's helping to identify who would be on the team, so getting that team built. But other aspects of it are around a little more technical, getting effective team meeting processes in place, communication protocols, governance structures, and then of course, using that team as the foundation for building capacity. So supporting ongoing learning among team members and building their competency to be able to use implementation strategies to support implementation and improvement. Just want to note that one of the ways we do build capacity, and it's a helpful hint in the guide, is that oftentimes ISPs facilitate those teams. And if you think of that as an I do, we do, you do, so sometimes the ISP is leading that work. Eventually, they're kind of co-leading it with some folks who've been identified as emerging leaders or champions for the work. And then eventually the ISP is no longer leading those teams. And that is how one of the strategies we use, of course, to be able to build capacity that exists beyond our specific involvement. Passing it off to be, oh no, we have a Mentimeter. So we are going to talk about the competency that you would like to develop further over the next 1 or 2 years. So anyone that has downloaded any of these materials will see that there's 15 competencies across these 3 domains. Just like a spoiler alert, really none of us have all 15 of them. So I like to think I have 14 or so, no, but the idea is that, you know, often when we are supporting implementation, we're doing that in teams because some folks might be better at certain technical skills, other folks might be better at relational skills, and both of those things are equally needed. But we'd be really curious to see what competency you would like to develop over the next 1 or 2 years in your own implementation support practice. And this is super cool. This is going to turn into a word cloud, so I'm excited about this.
Please put in your ideas, send them over to us.
We do see more and more these issues of kind of trust and power and relationships are getting more and more attention in the field of implementation. So it's fun to see that emerging.
Better standing. I wonder what that is about.
Reputation.
Yep,
I'd say.
it is.
Yeah. Credibility. It's a good one.
Yeah, and demonstrating credibility is a way to build trust, actually. So that's fantastic.
Mm. Cultivate leaders. Select implementation strategies. That is a difficult one. Very interesting. And very diverse as well. We have 22, 23 responses by now.
Okay, I need to take a photo. It's so great. So Bianca, does that mean that cultivating leaders was said?
Yeah, there is. So now you the size should mean a little bit. So there are more voices behind cultivate leaders, probably followed by build capacity, context sensibility, communication, because it has been selected by more people. Yeah. Very nice.
That's awesome.
31 results. Excellent. Thank you so much for this. I think we're going to move back to ensure that we have sufficient time for our discussion. So let us get back to the slides and then talk a little bit about dilemmas. Given what Alison just said, it's a large amount of expectation that is implicitly hidden in these competencies. A single person will hardly cover the entire range of competencies, and at the same time, implementation support practitioners work in very specific contexts in which they need to bring these competencies to bear, and that is not always an easy thing. Quite the opposite. They can face multiple dilemmas in their role and work. I think that is quite important to highlight, to not make them to these angels that can do everything. I think they have to be aware of these dilemmas, and we have listed 4 of these on this slide, and I want to walk us through them, beginning with dilemma number 1, where you could say, on the one hand, the literature reflects a high level of competency characterizing ISPs. On the other hand, there seem to be quite few, very few pathways for their professional development at the moment that can cater to the needs for knowledge and skill building they might have. Implementation support practitioners are not necessarily clearly defined roles. And probably because they operate at the nexus of policy, practice, and research, and not within just one of these fields. It's not a traditional role. So that raises the question how to adequately develop and support implementation support roles, and kind of grow this field into something that probably is clearer defined. Dilemma number 2 is about, on the one hand, to have fostered high expectations for implementation support practitioners to enable organizational change. I think ISPs are often brought in when there is an ambition to make some changes. But on the other hand, they may be ill-equipped to facilitate this change because of the way in which their roles are defined and established, often lacking clarity or a clear position within existing structures, lacking career development opportunities, all of these features that are normal for the more traditional roles in organizations. And that raises the question, how can implementation support practitioners become true agents of change that have a clear mission and a clear role description that makes it possible for them to really change the environments they're working in. Then dilemma number 3, on the one hand, it appears to be important that implementation support practitioners operate as allies to those they support. We're talking about trust here. On the other hand, they're also, at least in some roles, expected to track performance data related to the evaluation of staff performance. And that evaluative role potentially undermines the alliance that implementation support practitioners depend upon in their work, which raises the question, how can implementation support practitioners ensure to maintain these strong relationships with their supportees despite these tensions in their role descriptions? That is a tricky one, I guess. And then dilemma number 4, the final one, is about that the same organizations and systems that invite ISPs to facilitate change often get in the way of the change they request, simply because there's an inherent inertia in these organizations that make it difficult for them to respond positively and in an agile fashion to what an ISP suggests and works to change. So they may have good intentions, but when they understand what the change implies, they get second thoughts and don't provide the ISP with the tools and resources needed for them to make the changes. And that, of course, raises the question, how can this inherent inertia of the context in which ISPs work be more effectively broken up, so ISPs have a better chance to achieve what they were hired to do in the first place? So dilemmas are hard to respond. We don't have clear answers to these, but find that these are really interesting questions to discuss. Before we go there, one more comment on what is included in the practice resources that we have developed, and which Alison showed you the front pages of. The guide and practice profile were developed to help those engaged in implementation support to reflect on their work, the way in which their own or others' role has been set up, or the experience they gather in their support work. And at the very end of the guide, we have added 10 reflective questions that you see on the slide that may be helpful in thinking about what you already are doing or what you would like to do. And you can see how they are structured. They can be taken one by one or in groups. And we would be very interested in hearing how you might use them over time. And if you think there are further questions that would be good for others to consider, that would be really interesting for us to hear about and include in our future work. All right. Oh, that was too quick, and I need to get back. Sorry, I think I will get us back this way. All right. Okay, and it's really the final slide, basically announcing that this was our presentation. We want to move into discussion mode from here. I will stop sharing the slides. Pauline will go first. Please turn your camera on. You can open and close your mics as you want. We have that opportunity. So let's get started with that.
Yes, thank you. So yes, now we see everyone again.
Yep.
So many participants. Well, thank you, first of all, of course, sharing this with us, Alison and Katie and Bianca. I think this is what I also mentioned, and seeing that amount of attendees, a really relevant conversation to talk about the competencies of implementation support practitioners. And I think, you know, I think a lot of questions have been already really greatly been answered also by Alison and Katie and you guys in the chat. But I think when I look at the questions and think about, you know, everything that you have said, and I come across is this. So in our organization, in Zonnebay, we have a team of implementation specialists, and there are actually quite a lot of them right here in this session. So hi to the colleagues. But the main trouble that we face, or that I face as a staff member, is to enable implementation specialists to become a part of the organization. Simply said, there is never money to hire implementation specialists within the organization. It's really hard to finance them. And what is interesting is that as soon as they are in the organization and they are in a program, they are so highly valued, you know, they never leave. I mean, they just, everyone is like, implementation specialists, stay here. But to introduce them new in a program and find finances to have that specialist in the team really is a challenge. And I would love to hear your reflection on your experience with this, or maybe ideas to overcome this.
Who wants to go first? Alison, you're on mute.
Yeah, I wondered, Katie, if you want, I mean, because I was thinking CES has some really interesting ways that they kind of embed, you know, ISPs, or, you know, I didn't know if you wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that.
I was hoping for a good answer because I was thinking we could use the good answer. But anyway, I'll start the ball rolling and then others can. So I think it's a fabulous question, Pauline. I'm not just being polite. So how to convince others of the need for implementation support practitioners, implementation specialists, I think is the question. That sometimes there's funding for delivery of the service or the program or the policy, but not to support its implementation, which needs people with implementation expertise. So So we have found in Ireland, there are some organizations that do understand, that some public organizations that do understand that you need to you need to fund and support implementation. And then there are some that don't. And I would love to know why, what distinguishes one from the other. I don't know. That would be a good research project for somebody. I think part of the answer is that these people don't need to be called implementation specialists. They can be people who are nurse managers who are half-time supporting implementation of a particular initiative, but they need to be supported in that skill set too. So I would say they don't always have to be full-time specialists as implementation specialists. That might be a little controversial. I would also say, and I'm going to stop this, my final thought, that actually I have observed that when you find a good implementation specialist and you either train them or they come to you with a lot of the skills and then they get some expertise, the problem is they go somewhere else and use that expertise. So actually they're a very sought after, it's a very sought after skill set. So the good news for the individual professional is building up that skill set will really enhance your professional development. Sometimes the challenge for the organization is how to hold on to them.
Yeah, and I think Ayla also mentioned it in the chat that she actually also gave the tip, and that's another research project, I think, so if anyone has ever looked at quantifying the efforts of implementation specialists and what does it cost and what does it yield?
I typed that in the chat, I thought it was such a good question. We actually did this several years ago, and it was a lot of hours on some of the projects, and we had the funding to do it. What we learned from it is we really have to find ways to get more efficient, because most funders and partners, that amount of hours would overwhelm them. And so it kind of set us on this journey of thinking about everything we do and what to prioritize, how to more effectively and efficiently build teams, to how do we transfer learning in more effective ways. And I think because the field has been so new itself, the field of implementation science, the idea of building others' capacity to do it, that's just was kind of catching up, but I think we're kind of getting better at that. But yes, I think more kind of time, like design, like task hour designs need to be done on how much time we actually spend doing it.
And I guess there should be some, at least administrative data be available in some of the, the purveyor-driven types of programs that would have a financial model for having implementation support practitioners connected to particular programs and what those cost. But that, of course, then often is very program specific and is exactly the ISP model that would be really hard to use for every single program that a regular, let's say a social work organization is implementing. You just can't pay all the ISPs it would take to help you implement those different programs. So I really think it's a big problem. There are not very many cost studies in this field. And I also think, to get back to your original question, Pauline, that when you look at the studies that exist on ISPs, be they on facilitators or consultants or coaches or whatever you call them, it's typically, probably in 80% of the cases, these are research projects that are particularly funded. You have researchers that might provide the implementation support. They may collaborate with internal ISPs, but they get some of the research funding as well. And just the sustainability of ISP roles, really integrating them in the routine service settings and based on the staff who are available is definitely a challenge and a task ahead of us.
Yeah, and don't be shy at people, because I see everyone is muted, but you can raise your hand and you can chat. We have another 10 minutes for discussion, so do feel free, because I have seen many questions from Ernst Jan Wind. And I think also here you actually pose a really good one, saying, but in small organizations, and I think that leads on to the question, can we not just find people with the different competencies that we're looking for and get them to do the work. So maybe Ernst, can you explain your question a bit more, or your idea behind this?
Thank you. I have some children on the background, so that's
No problem. We love children.
Yes, in the Netherlands, primary care is divided between several little organizations, GPs, physical therapists, social organizations. And implementation is also important in that kind of organizations, but they don't have a lot of employees. So only GPs, only healthcare professionals. But quality improvement is most important, especially in primary care. So I think ISPs are can change over time, over projects, and so you can find people with an ISP ambition on a special theme of a special project, or and facilitating them from the network, from combined budgets.
Yeah.
Do you want to reply, Bianca?
Yeah, especially in the literature on facilitators and facilitation, you will find that nicely described, that you're not necessarily dependent. In order to enable facilitation in an organization, you're not necessarily dependent on just a single person or two who are these specialists. If you can build a team where different functions of facilitation are distributed across the team that you might have, so every single member of them can build on their particular strengths and abilities, and then they kind of supplement each other and fulfill the needs of the organization. That is definitely an idea that is out there. But I also think that it is already a progressed idea, because sometimes just basic competencies in small organizations related to doing facilitation, doing change management, doing data-driven improvement in itself requires some effort before these types of capacities are built across multiple people.
Yes.
One other thing I was thinking about with that too is that you have individuals with these competencies that feel a sense of individual accountability for using those competencies in their day-to-day work. But I think what the leap you'd want to make in kind of bringing together those varied people with those varied competencies is for them to understand their mutual accountability for the implementation effort and what aligned contribution looks like. That they're each contributing something that is really important towards implementation, whether that's data use, whether that's relationship building and kind of, making more cohesive networks. The idea is that you would want each of those individuals to be able to zoom out and understand how all of those competencies are important for the work. And so they then feel not just individual accountability, but mutual accountability, and they understand kind of the theory of aligned contribution, that their role is one of many roles that is needed to produce not only effective implementation, but outcomes. And so I think it's just kind of that painting that picture for everyone.
Yeah, and thank you, Alison. And I do see that Jacqueline also has a question, so I'll give you the word to you.
Yeah, I guess it's just a comment really on it, and I'm not sure I was one of the people who said I don't know about the implementation support piece. And we're three practitioners, but we're practitioner backgrounds, but recruited to drive a research project with 16 trial sites. But one of the kind of novel aspects to it is the funders, the Department of Justice, sponsored one practitioner from each of the 16 sites to undertake a master's program in the university that we're attached to. In return, then we're offering a very kind of close kind of case mentoring relationship, but their dissertation is a local implementation study regarding how they're implementing the intervention that we're supporting them to design. So we're getting constant feedback from them around the implementation process, but it's locally based. They're convening their own project teams and they're working with them. It has driven implementation, and they have been the support vehicle really for it locally on the ground. So it's been very much a reciprocal kind of relationship, but it's been I suppose it's proving really, really successful in terms of the motivation on the ground and the buy-in from the practitioners involved in each of those trial sites. But again, obviously there's financial implications around the sponsorship of that.
Yeah, I see Katie want to respond to that.
So I think we're having a really interesting conversation, which is a little bit about implementation teams, and it's a little bit about implementation specialists, which is not surprising because they work together. But so on an implementation team, you know, typically what you look to get is, if you have a team responsible for implementing something, you want on the team people who know about the intervention being implemented, whatever it is, the evidence-based practice or the new program or whatever it is, content knowledge of the intervention. And you also want some people with knowledge of how to implement. Sometimes that's called change management. Sometimes that's called facilitating change. We choose to call it implementation knowledge. So you need both of those on implementation teams. And then in my experience, where it's possible to have implementation teams have some support from somebody who really does understand, like, the stages of implementation, the barriers to implementation, all those sorts of things really helps. And that's what I would call an implementation specialist or an implementation support practitioner. So they don't need to understand the intervention, but they do need to have an empathy for the community and the context in which it's being implemented. And then I wanted to come back to the question, because I think it's kind of it's a kind of really practical question. If you have small organizations like primary care organizations, what do you do? Like, so mostly what happens is they just have to do it on their own. That's what happens. And I think that's what that gentleman was kind of saying. But I have seen a model whereby you can put together something at maybe regional level, or at, you know, that might be a person who could support some of those primary care organizations, a number of them, to do training, to learn from each other, et cetera, et cetera. So some kind of regional implementation support structure is often helpful. It needs to be funded is the issue there. Yeah,
That's a good one. Bianca has to leave because, of course, we're going into our keynote in a sec. So see you there, Bianca.
Thank you.
But we have 3 more minutes. So maybe I will just ask Alison and Katie for your final reflections also on the discussion. What did you think of the session and of the things that were being said? Maybe Alison wants to take the word.
Sure, I'll go. I'll just try and keep it. I loved all the questions. I think it is interesting, Katie's last comment about, we're talking about ISPs and we're talking about teams, and the two kind of go hand in hand. But I'm someone that really believes that the role of ISPs are critical to the work, whether they're external and they're coming in to support, or whether they're internal to an organization. I believe people need to be supported to implement. I've just been doing this for 20 years. I think it's really hard to kind of take a step back, to get on the balcony, to reflect, to do work with intention, because of the pace of the work, the urgency of the work, the scarcity of resources, elections, all sorts of things that interrupt funding cycles. And I really believe that having a skilled implementation support practitioner, wherever he or she sits in the life of the project, is really critical to the work. And I do believe it is really based in relationships.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. Yeah, and I think that makes this session also so highly relevant. And I think it continues into the conversation that will also be tomorrow in specific sessions on, so how do you train and educate people? Where do they get the competencies? Like, even if it's small ones, what are the opportunities in the different countries? So that's, even if you're going to miss it, it's well worth watching that back, because I think it's the continued conversation. When you talk competencies, it's talking how do you gain those competencies. For now, I want to thank you, Alison, Katie, and Bianca's already gone, but thank you again for hosting this symposia. really relevant. Everyone can download that guide. So I would definitely do that and suggest that and read it. And I'm pretty sure that you are okay if they contact you for any suggestions or anything. So that's a possibility. We have a 5-minute break, and then we're gonna go to our final keynote. So I hope to see you all there, and enjoy your last session there. All right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Pauline.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.